Right. Okay, well, welcome everyone to the session, which we've called MESH360, and it's actually a name that Steve, my co-presenter, came up with about 4 years ago. And multiple environment simulation hub, 360 to sort of indicate that we're looking at 360 environments. And so tonight we're going to give you a little bit of an overview of the last 4 years of work that we've been involved in. So we have a research cluster, and the MESH360 project is one of those cluster groups. You can find more at the website sotel.nz for the Scholarship of Technology Enhanced Learning. So this project was based in AUT, the Auckland University of Technology, where I was employed for 8.5 years, and now I'm working remotely for the University of Melbourne. Here's a QR code to our notes, so you can scan this if you want to follow along, or you can just type in the short code into your web browser, and I'll just copy and paste that into the chat as well. So the link's in the chat if you want to click on that and follow through. So a little bit about myself and Steve. You can follow both of us on Twitter. There's our Twitter addresses. Mine's at Tom Cochrane, and Steve's with his interesting surname at @ILO_Stephen. You might want to tell you a bit more about that later. And just a little bit of an intro to myself. This is called a pepeha, which is what we use as an intro in New Zealand, or Maori intro. And it just locates you, I suppose, within some of the geography of the land that's close to you. So my mountain is Mongawhiru, or Mount William. My river is the Waikato River. The waka that brought my ancestors to New Zealand was a sailing ship. My ancestry is Scottish. My name is Thomas Cochrane, and my home was in Tuakau, but I'm now currently renting in Cambridge. So that's just a little bit about me, and I'm sure Steve will introduce himself shortly as well. So this project really has been a transdisciplinary project. So it's involved a whole team of people from different disciplines, including paramedicine, our central educational technology support group, a app lab development team, and a team in Chile who are looking at biometrics and tracking biometrics data. So out of this project so far, we've produced several journal articles, conference papers. There's been Vice Chancellor teaching awards, and you can see some of the awards that we've had from the project. So I'm going to hand over to Steve, who's going to talk a bit about the context of the project, which is really paramedicine. So I'm going to stop screen sharing now, and over to you, Steve.
I'm just trying to share screens. Here we go. Can you see the screen?
Yeah, that's all good.
Okay. Hey, thanks for asking me to come along. My name is Stephen Aiello. My background is as an intensive care paramedic here within New Zealand and in the UK. So mostly from a clinical background, and I've been within Auckland University of Technology for the past 5 years, and I think working with Tom, we've sort of noticed some gaps in regards to simulation practice, and we try to sort of work with current technology to see whether we can enhance aspects of teaching and learning within the context of paramedicine. So I assume, Tom, you can see that main screen there, the multiple environment simulation hub?
Yeah.
Yep, cool. Okay, so just to give some context to the project, sort of healthcare simulation itself provides just lots of opportunities for learners to identify, practice and evaluate patients during various clinical events. This is particularly useful with those when those events are rarely encountered during routine clinical practice or within a dangerous environment. So we started looking at things like situational awareness within simulation. And situational awareness directly relates to simulation and can be thought of as an internal mental model of the current state of an individual's simulated environment. And this generally has three distinct levels. So we've got the perception of the simulated environment, the comprehension and understanding of the environment, and the projection or prediction of events in the future based on the perception and comprehension. So in part, situational awareness is formed by understanding the clues and cues of what has happened, what is happening in that environment, and being able to understand and predict the future events before they unfold. And together, these steps are required when we make decisions. So with this understanding, we looked at the concept of paramedic simulation and clinical practice and training and learning within the university. And you can see from this image here, this would be a traditional cardiac arrest, CPR simulated environment and scenario. And you can see that it lacks lots of influence. In fact, it's a static and staid environment where there's no influence whatsoever other than the plastic mannequin. And, with this, the current teaching within paramedicine and many healthcare providers offers limited environment detail. And this results in a lack of comprehension and limits the ability to predict those events. And when I mention those events, we as paramedics, as first responders, we can be presented with all manner of environments which it's difficult to train or prepare first responders for. Whether it's a fire, as you can see in this image here, or a car crash, these clues within this environment are really important to our decision making. And as we've mentioned, or I've mentioned before, is the ability to predict events. If we look at this image in isolation, it just simply looks like a car crash. But from my point of view as a clinician, I'm looking at many different things. I'm looking at the fact that this is an older model car and doesn't have an airbag. And if it did have an airbag and it was deployed, then for me, this shows that the impact of the car was of a high velocity and energy. We can see the buckle to the front of the windscreen and the bonnet of this vehicle, which also gives me an indication of the impact. I can also note things like the windscreen and the damage of the windscreen. If a patient or driver of a car is not wearing a seatbelt, then we'll often see in this right in front of the driver's seat what we describe as a bullet point in the windscreen, which is an indent in the windscreen from the inside, pushing the windscreen outwards. And as I say, this can give us an indication as to whether the driver of the car actually had a seatbelt on. If they didn't have a seatbelt on, then we can start to predict events. And those events essentially relate to the potential for severe traumatic brain injuries and head injuries, which then may well dictate our treatment and evaluation of that patient. So with this understanding, and not having environments which offer influence towards our training and learning within a university environment, and preparing our students for the real world, we decided that we would try to develop some ideas around virtual reality and immersive virtual reality and immersive environments in order to be able to support a more authentic environment for the trainee or student to be able to work within. So Tom now will give you an overview of the various iterations, the various projects that we've been playing with regards to virtual reality, immersive reality, and how we've linked this with some biometrics in regards to qualitative and quantitative research.
Great, thanks,
Tom,
Steve.
I'll
If you
put
just
that back to you.
jump out of screen sharing there, and I'll jump in.
Should be awesome.
Yeah, so as Steve said, we've been working together on these projects for well over 4 years now. So it's been a bit of a longitudinal study, which I think in itself makes it relatively unique. And so we decided really to embed the projects within a design-based research methodology. So it allowed us to take a stage approach to these and to reiterate, to redesign, to reprototype, to refine the various virtual reality environments that we've been exploring, and to get user evaluation, and to really come up with some design principles that can then be used in other contexts for simulation. So you can see some of our work that we've collated on ResearchGate. If you go to our ResearchGate project, search for MESH360. So as Steve said, we started 2016 knocking around ideas. 2017, we did a critical scene analysis using SeekBeak, which is a web-based virtual reality platform. And then there's a couple other associated projects where we got some other of the clinical health disciplines involved, nursing and physiotherapy, using a interprofessional handover. And then Steve created the AUT Health Hub as a virtual reality environment for students to be able to find out what the different clinical disciplines were like. Then in 2018, we started exploring biometrics and triangulating the virtual reality experience, the subject to feedback from students with biometric feedback, to get an idea of, is stress actually induced by these virtual environments, using heart rate, skin conductivity. And in 2018, it was very much a trial and see if there was some correlation or triangulation between those types of data, and we found there was. And then in 2019, we took that a step further and built on what we learned in 2018. You can see some of our publications around that and a bit of a summary on Twitter. And really at this point, we're really now analyzing all of the data. And Steve's going to show you some of the environments that we actually developed. A virtual helicopter ride. In 2018, it was a virtual ambulance ride for the students. So back to you, Steve.
Okay, so as Tom's mentioned, we've started to develop virtual scenes and environments, but also add in elements of biometric feedback. And the question around this is how do we best understand stress levels within clinical simulation? How is virtual reality affect the students or clinicians, or promote a greater awareness for the students within a clinical environment? But more importantly, also for future work, we'd be looking at things like to promotion of well-being and understanding stress levels within a situational awareness or virtual environment. So with this, we developed it was a very brief prototype of a helicopter trip, and I'll just talk this through shortly now. So learning itself is often aligned with the learner's emotional stress as they move beyond the bounds of prior knowledge in new and unknown environments. Stress indicators, as we've mentioned, can be measured by quantitative biometric data such as heart rates, galvanic skin resistance, and blood pressures. And this measures or helps them measure learner stress and can be aligned to significant learning events or critical learning incidents. Plus, the biometric data can be used to triangulate subjective learner feedback on the impact of the learning intervention or simulation. And in this image here, you can see that in this particular product, we used just a very basic equipment, an Apple iWatch and iPhones version 4 to record heart rates. The project iteration illustrates the prototype of health and educational research, which triangulated this data within a design-based research model. And we linked in with a helicopter rescue service within New Zealand called Westpac in order to develop this particular series of virtual scenes and environments. In addition to this, this is an example of a simulation, immersive simulation room. We also developed a prototype so that once the student had removed the virtual reality headsets, they were then immersed within a room in the same environment in order for them to treat the patient that was in front of them. And I'll explain what this means as we move on to the video. This is an example of one of the students. And within this scene, I'll talk it through as it goes through. But we can see in the bottom middle, we have the heart rate as we experience different things. So we have an initial base heart rate, which is round about the sort of 80 beats per minute mark. And then we've got some elevation as we come into the helicopter environment, and then some greater elevation as we take part in the actual simulation itself. Now, the simulation itself entails the use of a high fidelity mannequins. And these mannequins themselves, they breathe, they talk. We can give them wounds and heart sounds, so they're pretty realistic and you know, as I say, quite high-end technology. I'll play the video, and you'll see the transition of events, which leads from the initial video and experience being in a helicopter, the journey to the scene where the trainee paramedic or student then experiences the environment where they see the student, the patient from afar, and then approach the patient so that they can get that realistic overview of the scene and environment. And then you'll see that it transitions into the simulation room, which would be similar to this image here, only with the patient being the high fidelity mannequin on the ground, which then they would treat. I'll play the video.
Fuel time of 5 minutes, 45 minutes. ETA to scene approximately.
So here we have realistic sounds, helicopters inside the helicopter. This is what she sees. You can see on the TV wall in the background that we've got the heart rate as she begins the journey.
Control, Westpac Rescue 2. Now we're born
now, this
from
was a prototype,
to
and we're in the process now of developing this
5 POV, ETA
rate
10
of
minutes,
fidelity.
and start time of 1205.
We can see the heart rate just increasing slightly with the addition of sound. And then we used
AUT Helimed, comms calling AUT Helimed. You are being dispatched to a 50-year-old male, rural location who has fallen.
We used Google Geo Maps to landscape outside the window. So this is real landscape in Auckland. And the image you see on the right-hand side is actually what she's looking at.
Too low. Terrain. Terrain.
She's now given distance, there's a man at the bottom of the tree. So she can focus the scale of the environment, the tree, and also for access out of this area by helicopter. She now moves towards the patient where she can get more of a visual clue. Here we've got a chainsaw which is running, and the man has a deformed leg. We also see a ladder quite high into the tree, and we might make the assumption that he's fallen from a significant height. This next step is now that she's moved into the environment and the patient is on the ground talking to her and moaning in pain with the deformed leg that you saw in the image. Once we'd completed the simulation itself, and you can see from the graph at the bottom that we had heart rates up to 140 beats per minute, whereas we had a resting baseline rate of 80. We then interviewed directly after the event the students as to their overall feelings and experience in relation to the virtual environment that they've just experienced.
Great, well thank you for doing the simulation for us, and we're just after a little bit of feedback. So we've got 3 simple questions. The first question, what was the impact of the 360 experience on the quality of your clinical simulation learning?
I think it was better because I could visualise the patient before I had to treat them, which is what would happen normally. You would arrive at scene, you can see the scene and you can picture what's around you. And I immediately could see what had happened to the patient, whereas normally I'd have to ask all of those questions when I go into the simulation.
Okay, and you're a paramedic lecturer, so you've got a fair bit of experience of simulations. Just wondering what you think are the key differences between 360 VR environment and the traditional classroom approach?
I think it's more realistic, so I think it better prepares the student for the experience, and I think it can take some of the awkwardness out of the simulation because you're already in the zone, if you know what I mean. And I think too, in going to out on the road, then you're actually better prepared for that because you've seen some images to prepare your mind for what you could experience.
Great. And last question, based on your experience of the project, would you like to see more VR and paramedic training?
Definitely, yes.
Cool. Do you think you might be able to build it into your practice somehow?
Yes, absolutely.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay, so that gives you just an overview, a brief idea as to the development of the latest iteration, which, as you can see, we've got some marked increased heart rate by various stimulation, whether that was the simulation itself or whether it was the helicopter journey. We've been able to break that down within this particular paper that we've written, which Tom will give you at the end. So it was a real success, and we found that a lot of students gained a lot more insight into the scene, and we didn't need to use imagination so much. So it gave them those the important clues towards decision making within this critical environment. Okay, I'll pass you now on to Tom, who is going to talk about the methodology behind these
thanks, Steve. Projects. So I'm going to talk a bit more about the actual methodology of the research. So you can see that our research question really was focusing around trying to make the clinical simulation environment much more authentic, rather than the prior way of doing it, which was just a verbal introduction to the scene, and then a whiteboard room with a high fidelity mannequin in the middle of it, which was not particularly authentic, and it certainly didn't add all the environmental stress or the sort of scenario that we really wanted the students to be able to focus on. And so that was really the key question that has gone through the 4 years of this project. So because we're using design-based research, effectively there's 4 stages. So the first stage really was the analysis and exploration and identifying the issues that we wanted to address with the project. The second phase being the design of the prototype environments. A third phase being evaluation of those, and each year we've evaluated what we've done, and that has led into a better design in the following year, and being able to build on what we've done in the past and add, for example, the biometric tracking and what we learned in our first trial of the biometric tracking and the prototype devices weren't really up to the stresses, and so we ended up using an Apple Watch with an app. And then, of course, building into theory building as we go through the longitudinal study. So we used a few design principles to help us guide the whole process that have been developed out of a range of virtual reality projects that we've been doing, but have become a fundamental sort of baseline for these projects, really basing it within a design-based research methodology. So that's the fundamental one. Supporting the projects through establishment of a community of practice. So it's a collaborative team. So Steve being the key person in paramedicine, and some of the other projects and other disciplines involving people in those, Todd in physiotherapy and etc., people in other disciplines. Really trying to focus on developing student capabilities, and that's linking back to heutagogy, if you haven't heard of heutagogy, which is student determined learning. So we're really wanting to develop those critical thinking skills for the graduates, to go beyond competency, to go beyond what they can just reproduce, to be able to really troubleshoot new and unique environments, which is key in paramedic training, because every site, every incident is going to be unique, and they have to be able to troubleshoot those. Making sure that we're actually using authentic use of the devices, that it's not just a gimmick, and really trying to integrate collaboration and teamwork into the projects. So we've based this around a transdisciplinary team, a group of people, because there's not one person that has all the skills that we need. So myself being the academic advisor in this case, so the educational research is my background, educational technology. We have a digital development team with the app lab led by Claudio, the paramedic lecturers led by Stephen, and there's also Norm and Stuart. We teamed up with some biometric researchers from Chile initially, and we used their protocols and software. And in the last iteration, we used the Apple Watch. And of course, the students as well. So involving the participants in the evaluation of the research. So in 2019, last year, we had 27 participants. These were a range of different levels. So first year students right up to full-time practicing paramedics, and then a range of second, third year and postgraduate students. So it allowed us to also sort of get an idea of the impact on people's different levels of experience. We did make sure that we got ethics consent. So we've had ethics consent for all the projects through the AUT ethics consent process. Really, we've built on what we've learnt, and really pretty much refined a process of being able to do this enhanced simulation. So the process, or the framework that we've come up with, really is shown here on this table, where we recruit volunteers for the projects, and it's all done on a volunteer basis. We do a pre-survey of the students to gather basically a baseline, what their prior experiences are. We use biometric sensors, risk-based ones, and the first part of the simulation really gives us a baseline. So there's a nice calming scene in the environments to calm the participant down, and that gives us a baseline, because every participant is going to have a different baseline of heart rate. And so we can't measure against one, we have to measure against each individual participant. And then we go through the experience, the virtual reality experience, and it's about 10 minutes long. Because with the head-mounted displays, you don't want a very long experience because you can end up with various effects like motion sickness, etc. if the experience is too long and they're not used to it. Then this is followed up by a straight away post VR experience diagnosis, where Steve would ask them, what do you think from the VR experience? What are the symptoms? How are you going to treat the patient? Then they go into the clinical scenario and treat the high fidelity mannequin. And after that, after getting the cues from the actual mannequin, they do a post diagnosis and we see if it agrees with their pre-diagnosis. And then we interview them, get some subjective feedback, and then a final survey. So that's kind of the methodology and process. You can see in the diagram here, using the Oculus Go, we were screen sharing that so we could monitor where the students were at in the process, rather than having to stand around and ask them questions and interrupt the authenticity of the process. You can see in this last iteration, we actually strapped the students into a chair, so they got a physical sort of a feedback loop of actually feeling like they were harnessed inside a helicopter. And so all those sorts of elements, the sound was incredibly important, we found. So just having video didn't give much in the way of stress response from the students. It was the addition of the audio that really increased the stress from the simulation. And Steve's walked you through an example of how we triangulated the heart rate with the various aspects of the simulation and the actual clinical simulation as well. So we did ask the students and the various 5 levels what they thought the impact was on their learning and their stress levels. And they were most stressed during the actual clinical simulation. There's a few reasons for that. I guess it was a bit more authentic actually treating a mannequin, but the helicopter ride did come up quite high, which we were quite pleased about. But for a lot of the first year students, this was the first time they've actually done a clinical simulation with a mannequin, and of course they were going to be extremely stressed because they'd never done one before. We've done a bit of mapping of the heart rate, well, the maximum heart rate for each of the experience levels. You can see it jumps around a bit, but there's effectively a line here showing that as experience increases, then the maximum heart rate or the stress levels comes down, which I guess we kind of expect because a practicing paramedic is used to this sort of stressful environment already. So I guess what we take out of this is that we are inducing stress into our students, and that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to simulate a stressful activity using a safe virtual reality environment. So in conclusion, I guess we feel that we've managed to achieve most of our goals, and we're still building on this. We're still analyzing the data, and Steve's going to talk about where we're heading in the future.
Okay, well, let's just make that a bit bigger. So I guess a major outcome of design-based research is the robust innovation plus new theoretical knowledge. And in this case, a set of refined design principles that others may be able to use in future efforts to convert traditional simulation into authentic learning environments. Clinicians are constantly faced with situations that require on-the-spot thinking and response. As with many other industries, design-based research fundamentally here changes the focus of the research from what is often the fruitless question of really what works to the more acceptable, responsible question of asking what is the problem and how can we solve that problem and what new knowledge do we have, and to what extent can these problems be addressed using innovative learning designs with appropriate applications of technology derived from a solution. So the implication for practice and policy and for future would be redefining the role of clinical simulation and health education to support advanced critical learning within an immersive VR environment. And this in itself offers a validation of the impact of immersive virtual reality and clinical simulation training to replicate high-risk care situations and offer an element of well-being to the students by promoting both patient and student safety in an intense and stressful learning environment. So ultimately, these are transferable design principles, which we hope to develop authentic immersive reality enhanced simulation, which if we try to get an understanding of the stress levels by the biometric feedbacks, then we can better understand how we can put students and clinicians safely through a simulation with the use of virtual reality, and give them the all-important environmental feedback so that they can pick up on those clues and cues and promote hopefully better clinical practice. So from a point of view of future, I think whilst this is within the principle of design-based theory, and often develops and changes in different directions, the key to this is being authentic and providing something which is not contrived, but actually is usable by many and multiple industries in order to provide skill and a learning environment. And I think that's one of the key goals for this project. That's it for me.
Yeah, so thanks, Steve. So yeah, the key really is that we believe that virtual reality has a real place in higher risk education environments. Obviously, we don't want to be killing our students, but we do need to prepare them for those sorts of environments. So some of the other domains that we've been looking at are in mountaineering, and I have a PhD student who's exploring virtual reality for educating mountaineers on how not to kill themselves when they're climbing the mountains, to avoid things like altitude sickness, avalanches, falling down crevasses, etc., that sort of thing. And it's often the more experienced climbers who actually end up killing themselves because they push themselves beyond their limits. They think they know it all. So that's an interesting scenario in other contexts as well, such as physiotherapy and nursing, etc. So Steve's actually hoping to embark on a PhD using what we've learned over the last few years as a basis for exploring virtual reality and high risk first responder training. So we're over to questions, really. So welcome any questions.
Thank you. Hi, this is Andre. Maybe I should turn on my camera.